Well, on today's episode, we have my friend and neuroscientist, Dr. Devin Effinger. He shares the chemical process on the brain with addiction and also with recovery. And then we talk about some interesting psychedelic stuff. So tune in. Welcome to Impacting Recovery Uncensored. I'm your host, Sarah Pritchard. This is a podcast where we dive deep into the real, uncensored truths about addiction, recovery, and everything in between. No sugarcoating, no judgment, just honest conversations that can help lift up the solution. So let's get started. Today, I'm very excited. This is a special, special day. My good friend, longtime friend, and neuroscientist Dr. Devin Effinger. How are you?
I'm great.
How's it going?
Yeah, it's awesome. It's good to be here. Good to see you.
I know, it's so crazy. I was thinking, I'm like, oh my gosh, this is like over 20 years.
Yeah.
Which ages us, sorry. But
yeah, totally. It's definitely a full circle moment. Crazy to be here on the other side with you.
I know. I'm really excited. Okay, so today I want to talk about the brain and addiction and neuroscience and all the things. I think that is so interesting and fascinating, and a lot of people don't understand why this is considered a disease, essentially. I have alcoholism, and I still am confused about it all, and I know there's just a lot there. So I'm really excited. I think this is going to help a lot of people. So again, thank you.
Yeah, of course.
So I would love to know just kind of first what sparked your interest in neuroscience, and was there any particular moment or experience that drew you into this field?
Yeah, so there's actually, I guess, multiple answers to that. But I'll say the very beginning was when I was 15 and I had a traumatic brain injury. And after that incident, I had to relearn how to talk, essentially. I was having issues with basically linking thoughts to words. And I think that was the first time I was really clued into just how important the brain is and how subtle changes to, whether it be an insult due to injury, can completely prevent you from certain functions that I think we take for granted.
Yeah.
And I think that was the beginning for me. Obviously, if you would have asked me at that time what I was going to become a neuroscientist, I think everybody in high school certainly would have put their money against that being the case, But
Yeah.
But I think for me, it was after getting sober, I helped build a nonprofit, and I was working with at-risk youth and incarcerated individuals, and we would go into the jail, and we had this, basically, I co-developed this 6-week restorative justice program. And we did that for about 5 years, and I always kick myself for not collecting data, but basically at the end of that 5 years, I had this realization that probably high 90%, 98% of the people that I had worked with had all, over the course of 6 weeks, eventually opened up about some traumatic event that happened to them when they were children. And this trauma set the stage for the development of negative belief systems, which led to maladaptive behavior patterns. And then you get in trouble, and when you're in the system, it's not designed for you to get out. So here's a group of people that society basically deems as terrible people, throw away the key, but really they're just traumatized children that didn't get help. And so that realization is what sent me back to school and to basically pursue neuroscience as a way of addressing whatever happens to the brain following trauma so that it doesn't fester and become some kind of a disorder.
That's amazing. That is so crazy.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's get into the addiction piece.
All right.
I have read and seen very little about kind of the brain's reward system, and again, it being a disease. And I remember even when I was in treatment, they did a family program, and they're the brain lights up in different ways and different things, or just responds differently. And that's so, it's just, I don't know. It's very interesting to know that my brain is different than maybe my sister's, because that makes sense of maybe why there's not this control piece or choice piece. But as far as the reward system goes, what does that look like, and how does it kind of get hijacked and the substance goes in, or or if you
Yeah.
could just explain all that.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
So I think the best way to do that is like take a step back and understand that not only humans, but basically all mammals, any sort of complicated organism with a central nervous system or a brain is basically designed to seek things that are rewarding through the release of dopamine and other chemical neurotransmitters in order to propagate survival, right? So it's like reproduction is reinforced through the release of dopamine. Highly palatable foods, when you eat them, they taste good. There's a release of dopamine, and this is all part of like learning.
Yeah.
And so our brains are literally designed to repeat things that cause the release of dopamine, and that's how we've all any successful species that hasn't been selected against through evolution exists because it's an ability to repeat actions that provide value to that organism, right? And so human beings are no different. Now the problem is that sort of reward system that we have was never prepared to be exposed to something as stimulating as drugs of abuse.
Okay.
That drugs of abuse are like go right to the source and provide releases of dopamine and activation of this, what they call the mesolimbic reward pathway, to a degree that's completely unnatural.
Okay.
And so basically what happens over time is when you use these drugs, the brain responds to changes in the environment, if you will. So it's like there's a massive increase in the release of dopamine when you drink alcohol or whatever the drug of choice may be. And if you do that repeatedly, the brain's response would be to slow down the activation, and it would do so by pulling what they call down-regulating dopamine receptors.
Okay.
And so it's like the flow of dopamine is so high, so the way in which to calm that down would be to pull the receptors. And then what can happen over time is that you in order to experience some sort of normal level of pleasure, you have to have the level of stimulation that only the drug is capable of producing.
Right. So does that have anything to do with like tolerance or, because for me, I don't know. There's weird stuff. Like you can have like reverse tolerance, and then there's like your tolerance goes up, and like the same amount of alcohol wasn't doing the same for me as it was, 15 years ago, and then 10. And so is that the brain? Is something happening up there with the tolerance scenario?
Yeah. So you can imagine. So there's a part of the brain called the striatum, or the ventral striatum, or the nucleus accumbens. It has a variety of different names.
I will not remember one of those words.
Nobody will probably remember here today. But that basically is a region where dopamine is released onto, and that's like a hallmark of any drug, right? So opiates, cocaine, marijuana, alcohol, at the surface level, they activate different receptors. But at the end of the day, any drug that has an abuse liability activates this mesolimbic reward pathway, which ultimately leads to dopamine release onto the nucleus accumbens. And so you can think of like the dopamine is being released, like the way that neurons work is that there's like an electrical signal, and at the end of that neuron, it releases a neurotransmitter, like dopamine, and then it binds to another cell on the receptor, which causes another activation, and that's how circuits work in the brain or whatever. And so when the flow is so high, like I said, it pulls back receptors, and then eventually you need more of it in order to reach certain level, because it's pulled back the receptors. In order to reach the same level of stimulation that you've grown accustomed to, you have to have even more dopamine release, which is you need even more of the drug, or even to drink even more in order to achieve the same amount of activation.
That is so crazy. So as far as like withdrawal symptoms and how that plays a role, and obviously you and I both have experienced withdrawal symptoms, and then we used or drank again.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess I don't really know what my question is. Maybe like why with withdrawal symptoms, like they're awful. So why is that not bad enough essentially for me to stop drinking, where like a non-alcoholic has a, embarrassing experience, and they're like throwing up all night and everything, and they're like, I'm never drinking Jaeger again. Like, why can't we do that, I guess?
Yeah. So I think one thing I'll quickly say, just to talk about withdrawal, right? So as I alluded to, and one great example is like alcohol and benzos, right? Like we've all heard that if you stop cold turkey, you run the risk of potentially dying due to seizures.
Yes.
And so part of that's because those two drugs activate the same GABA system, but in different ways. So when you're chronically activating this GABA system through drinking alcohol or taking benzodiazepines, what can happen is you pull back these GABA receptors, and so GABA, at the end of the day, there's dopamine, there's serotonin, but at the end of the day, there's either excitatory or inhibitory, meaning something gets activated or something gets slowed down or inhibited. And glutamate is the primary excitatory, and GABA is primary inhibitory neurotransmitter. And so when you're drinking alcohol chronically, the brain pulls back GABA receptors. And so all of a sudden, when you pull off the alcohol, you have massive increases in glutamate. Like there's overexcitation because you've pulled away the brakes that you normally have in place of that. And so usually withdrawal symptoms are kind of the reverse of whatever the drug of abuse is providing for that person, right? So if you stop taking amphetamines, you sleep for 3 days.
Yeah.
If you stop taking opiates, you have terrible pain, and amongst a variety of opiates is a little different because the receptors are all over the place. So, meaning at deep brain structures like the brainstem. I think to get to your question, so part of that we don't know. Like we don't fully understand like why some people are more susceptible or more resilient to developing, like how some people can go to the hospital and be prescribed Oxycontin or whatever is the modern day version of that, and not develop a use disorder, whereas some people do.
Yeah.
And that we don't fully understand, but I think a lot of it does have to do with, the brain. The brain when you activate, as I alluded to, when you activate this mesolimbic reward pathway, it creates really salient memories. It's like so that in the future, if you were like a cave woman back in the day, and you ate some berry that was like really sweet and like had a lot of calories, you would remember that bush. It's the best thing for you to be able to remember exactly what that bush looks like.
Yeah.
And so the same thing happens with drugs, even though eventually there's all sorts of consequences that are associated with our drug use or drinking. Our brain still tags it as a very salient and important memory, given the amount of activation of this reward pathway that it induces.
Okay, so that's crazy because it's like that makes sense with when we talk about this obsession in the recovery circles and like the mental piece that every time, for example, one of the examples I would have every time I picked back up again, it's like, this time it'll be different. This time it's not going to get out of control. I'm just going to have a couple here, or, screw it, I don't care. And I really do care about my family. And so that makes sense because it's like my brain is really focused on, no, right now it's going to be okay because I'm going to have some sort of like ease and comfort from the drink. And I'm not going to get out of control. I'm not going to, like, the consequences are there, but, like, I'm not, like, I look at this as a good thing. Like, alcohol is a good thing. Like, in that moment, that's what I'm thinking kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so that makes sense if, like, the brain just continues to go back to, like, like the berry in the bush.
Right.
I need the berry.
Yeah, totally.
So that's really interesting.
Yeah. And the other piece of that, too, is... So the mesolimbic reward pathway is like subcortical, meaning it's an older structure. Animals like mice, rats, they all have these similar equivalent type of structures. And part of what makes human beings more advanced is we have this like highly developed prefrontal cortex. Other animals have frontal cortexes as well, but it's not to the same level of sophistication as what humans or primates have. And so the mesolimbic reward pathway in that nucleus accumbens that I was telling you about there are projections from the prefrontal cortex to that region that are essential for, like, if you eat the berry, but then like 30 minutes later you throw up because the berry made you sick.
Yeah.
That part of your brain is essential in like reprogramming that memory. Okay, actually it did taste good, but that was a terrible thing.
Yeah.
And you can create like an aversion. Like it's happened to me before where I ate some cantaloupe and I got sick. and I'll probably never eat cantaloupe ever again.
Yeah.
And it's because, and that's, as you can imagine, evolutionarily a very important mechanism. And so what also happens over time with use disorders is that connection between the prefrontal cortex and the ventral striatum or the nucleus accumbens becomes dysregulated. Mm-hmm. Additionally, when drug use goes from goal-directed, meaning like I'm using this and I get it's rewarding and like I enjoy the feelings, to more habitual, mm-hmm. there's actually a shift from the ventral striatum to the dorsal striatum. Again, complicated. Nobody's going to remember the names, but the point is there's a shift in the part of the reward pathways that as a action shifts from goal-directed to habitual.
Yeah.
And that when it shifts to that region, there are less inputs from the cortex. So you lose the ability to have that logical, like actually, if I think about this at the big picture, this is overall a net terrible thing that I'm doing.
Yeah. You
lose the ability to have that logical reasoning. And it's just and it becomes more habitual and primal. And so this is where, there's a lot of debate around is it a disease or is it a choice? And,
right.
and at least in the acute stages of alcoholism or addiction, you neurobiologically do not have the ability to have logical thought surrounding drug use. And so in that sense, it absolutely is like a disease, in my opinion. But
well, I'm so glad you pointed that out, because so many, I mean, even people going through it, but especially families and loved ones and friends of addicts and alcoholics, they're like, she just got out of the hospital and she's drinking again, or he just OD'd and he's high again, or he's going to lose his kids, or she's going to lose her kids. And so to know that there is, like, we don't have the power in active addiction to be able to overcome that is good to know, just in a sense of like it, like you said, like you believe it's a disease. I mean, I believe it's definitely bigger than me. I mean, if we're powerless, that means we need something, right? And so yeah, I'm really glad you pointed that out, because I mean, even the other day, it's talking to someone, they're like, I didn't know it was a disease. And yeah, it's a very confusing thing, because even when I was going through it, I'm like, how can I have no choice and control over my own body? Like, that's crazy. Surely I can figure this out.
Right.
And then I could not figure it out.
No. Yeah. And I think the word disease is tough, because you think about like more serious ailments that are not sort of by the choice of that individual, right? Yeah. So that's where like disorder, that sort of terminology, I think is a little bit easier to digest. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, regardless of how we define it, there's no question that when somebody is in the throes of addiction or a use disorder, they're operating at a handicap. They don't have full control over their cognitive processes.
Yeah. So as far as, you kind of touched on it, but, and we were talking about this just a minute ago before we started, but the like genetics piece, or outside situations that happen when we're children or younger, and trauma and depression, and like all these different things that I guess would quote unquote make somebody an addict or an alcoholic. Can you speak to that?
Yeah. So I think there's some misconceptions in this area. Like you hear people, oh, I have addictive personality, or I'm afraid that I have the addict gene or whatever, right? And the reality is, use disorders are what we would call polygenic. There are alterations in certain genes that are associated with higher risks of use disorders, but there isn't a single gene that one could have that's going to guarantee or be an all-encompassing gene that we would focus on. Yeah. With use disorders. There can be alterations in genes with like certain dopamine receptors or opiate receptors that would increase the sensitivity to drugs. So somebody who has a certain variation in the mu-opiate receptor, a gene for the mu-opiate receptor, may have a heightened sensitivity to opiates, meaning they may feel more pleasure when they take opiates. And I've seen that sort of anecdotally, where some people feel like, oh, I'm kind of getting dizzy and nauseous, and other people are like, this is like the thing I've been missing my whole life. Yeah. And so those sorts of things we are aware of those sorts of alterations in genes that may or gene expression that may influence the development of a use disorder. But yeah, there's no a single gene. I think, and again, this is sort of I think there are different camps as far as people thinking that, oh, this is a hereditary thing.
Right.
My opinion is that with these psychiatric disorders, the environment plays more of a role than genetics, I think. Meaning, like, in my experience, having spent years working with people with use disorders, be it when I was in the jail or in my own personal journey, it seems like everyone can when they tell their story, there's something, even if it's just perceived trauma. And that's the thing, right? The brain doesn't know the difference. You could be, in some war country, or you could have been really rich and your parents just were never around. It doesn't really matter to the developing brain. If it's a perceived trauma, you can start to perseverate on that or develop negative belief systems. And so the thing about that is, like, psychology and biology are not separate, right? So whatever you're experiencing psychologically, like feelings of abandonment, there's a neurobiological root to that. And it can result in alterations in all kinds of systems, right? So, like, early childhood adversity can cause dysregulation in the oxytocin system or the dopamine system. And so this can then lead to a person not feeling well.
Yeah.
And then once they experience drugs or alcohol, it provides relief. And that was certainly my experience. It was like, I didn't know it. It's like if you broke your arm and it healed wrong, and then you had it rebroken, and all of a sudden you're like, wow, I didn't realize I've been in pain my whole life.
Yeah.
That was sort of the experience that I had, and I think a lot of people seem to share about. And so I think, but then again, that's pointing to areas that we don't know as much, that whole susceptibility versus resilience thing, like what makes somebody more susceptible versus not.
Right.
Two different people can grow up in the same household with the same alcoholic father, and one person never touches alcohol and the other one becomes a burnout drunk. And it's just like how that happens is still something we don't quite understand.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so interesting. Well, and I think I'm glad you shared all of that, because everyone has different stories, everyone has different consequences, everyone has different upbringings, and yet everyone, we can all have the same thing, this addict, alcoholic, disease, whatever you want to call it. But then there's people that have gone through exactly what each of us have gone through, and they're over here and they never have a problem. So it's tricky.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So as far as, I don't even know how I want to say this or ask this, but like medications like methadone, naltrexone, Suboxone, those are, I understand why they were created and why they're there. But can you speak to what they do for them, just generally kind of what those medications do and why, or if you think that is a fix or not?
It's a great question. And I think this reminds me of so I did a 2-year fellowship at the National Institute on Drug Abuse, part of the NIH. And I went there thinking that, like, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, thinking this is the world's leading experts in addiction, And as I was there, and they are, but as I was there, I realized that most pharmacological, meaning medication type of treatments that we have for use disorders are really focused on just blocking that specific receptor, blocking the effects, right? So methadone is a mu opiate agonist. So, which is also heroin and other abused opiates are also agonists. And so basically it's when an agonist is something that binds to a receptor and activates it. Mm-hmm. And so methadone is basically just a way in which if somebody's wanting to get off of heroin, they can take methadone and it will curb the withdrawal symptoms.
Okay.
Naltrexone is an antagonist, which is the opposite of an agonist. So basically, not the opposite, but an antagonist will bind to that same receptor and it will block activation. So if you take naltrexone, it will block the effects of other, if you were to take heroin, you would not have the same pleasurable effect. So the mu receptor is sort of what underlies the pleasurable effects of opiates. So these drugs basically just, in my view, are a way to assist people who are trying to get off of the drugs.
Okay.
I mean, naltrexone is a little different because it can, block the effects or whatever. And then naloxone's like a competitive antagonist. It completely will knock everything off the receptor, which is why it's used to reverse withdrawal. So, in my opinion, and sort of what I realized when I was at NIDA, that was what we called the National Institute on Drug Abuse. It was like, well, we're missing the point here, Like I remember there was an experiment going on where they had done like a pre-treatment of methadone, thinking that it would almost like act as like produce satiety, meaning like, oh, I've had enough, I don't want any more, so it would stop the animal from using more of this opiate, but it didn't.
Yeah.
And they were puzzled, and to me, having had lived experience,
right.
I was like, the reason why these drugs work, like the prerequisite is that person has to want to stop, And so, in my, I think they serve a great purpose. I know a lot of people that have used these medication-assisted therapy, and it's saved their life, especially in the age of like fentanyl, where it's like, whatever it takes for you to stop using these drugs and risking your life every day, great.
Yes.
I'm not here to judge. You
Yeah.
know? But I think ultimately we're missing the point, right? Like those do serve a purpose, but they're not going to cure addiction or whatever.
Yeah.
Because addiction seems to have, or use disorder seems to have more of a psychological root that doesn't get addressed by simply masking the symptom of withdrawal.
Right. And so with like blocking the receptors, that just means like someone cannot OD if they're taking, or can they? Like one of those?
It kind of depends.
Okay.
And this is where like pharmacology can get kind of complicated. So basically, like there are all kinds of ways of studying like how much affinity or a drug or a ligand would have to the receptor, and if certain drugs have more affinity, or they can outcompete other drugs at that receptor, right? So it's like naloxone can knock off. Picture an OD situation where somebody is overdosed on fentanyl and all of their mu receptors are bound by this agonist, and it's causing them to stop breathing. You do naloxone, and because it has more competition for that receptor, it wants to bind to the receptor to a greater degree than these other drugs, it will knock it off.
Yeah. And is that Narcan?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's what I thought.
Yeah.
Which is like the best thing. I feel like every person should have Narcan, and police officer, teacher, I just think everyone should have it. But total tangent.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, yeah. Thank you for that. And I just think about because I know there's one that is for alcohol too, and like I just remember being an IOP, and so getting prescribed one of those things, and they're like, you cannot drink on it, like you will get so sick. And I didn't, but I remember somebody else in there did, and they were so sick.
Yeah.
And it's like they're still trying to have the effect produced. They're still trying to. I hear it all the time. People that are on Suboxone, they're like, they decide to. Well, I don't want to give people ideas, but they just don't do it, and they want to go back to the other drugs because they need to change the way they feel. And so obviously there's something deeper to fix if the addict and alcoholic are like, no, I'm going to take these pills, but maybe the alcohol will still work, even though I throw up everywhere. Maybe I'll still get some sort of effect produced.
Yeah.
So I like how you mentioned we're missing the point, because I too believe they serve a purpose. I believe all of that is super beneficial. But as far as why the addict and alcoholic drinks and uses, that's really I think where the focus needs to be.
Yeah. Well, and also just not it's like I alluded to earlier, how all these different drugs. So you're referring to antabuse or methadone. All these drugs are sort of targeting the exterior, meaning the first receptor the drug binds to. But some of some of these newer drugs, like people are interested in like GLP-1 agonists and all these things that are acting more on like the mesolimbic reward pathway. Like, because at the end of the day, regardless of what receptors are being activated up here, the thing that's perpetuating use disorder really stems with the mesolimbic reward pathway. And that's also why somebody has a hard time in early sobriety, because that system's dysregulated and you just don't feel good.
Yeah.
You can't feel pleasure from life because you're used to, a fire hose of dopamine versus like the normal garden hose that everyday life provides.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so interesting. And that makes sense. And that makes sense why I believe like being in a community or treatment or just in those early days, it's so important to have like that support and to have other people that, or at least for me, to have other people that have gone through what I've gone through. So I can say like I remember one time my sponsor, I'm talking to her on the phone, like a couple weeks sober, and she's like, "Hey Sarah, how's it going?" I'm like, "Not great." Everybody is talking in recovery, like talking about how great their lives are and God and all this stuff, and I'm not feeling it. And she was like, "Well, thank God you don't have to trust your thoughts or feelings right now, and you can trust the process." And I hung on to that because I had my like true surrendered moment of like, I can't live like this anymore. Kind of like you were talking about, like you have to want it a little bit, like just a little. It doesn't have to be a lot, but just a little bit more than you don't. And I had the experience of trusting my thoughts and feelings and burning it to the ground over and over and over. And so that was very much like what I needed early on, was somebody to be like, it's going to be okay. It's okay that you feel bad. That's normal. Let me show you what to do, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Because otherwise it's just like, I feel bad. I need something.
Yeah.
Because that's how I lived my life.
Yeah. Yeah, and it takes a while for it to like regulate, right? It's like what I was saying earlier, like you use these drugs or you drink for multiple years, the brain's like, okay, well, I guess we don't need this many dopamine receptors since there's this fire hose of dopamine every single day.
Right.
And then you pull away the fire hose and all of a sudden, like your little garden hose is only activating a couple of the sparse receptors that are available for it to activate. And so you're not getting the activation of this reward pathway that you need in order to feel good.
Yeah.
And so it just takes a while for the brain to understand that, okay, the environment's changed now. Let's bring back some more receptors, increase our likelihood of getting activated by whatever dopamine exists.
Yeah.
And that just takes a while.
Yeah.
And I think that's like the crux of the problem. And so focusing there to help maybe modulate that system or bring it back online a little bit quicker might be a better alternative to help somebody through that early stage of like, life sucks and this is uncomfortable.
Yes.
Which, by the way, good job, right? Like a lot of people, I always worry about the people that are like, yeah, I'm doing great. This is awesome. I'm like, are you though?
Yeah.
You're not supposed to be.
I know.
This is not good. There's a million reasons why it should not be great right now.
Yes.
And those are usually the ones I've found that end up going back out.
I know. It's so funny. I said that to someone the other day. I was like, how are you? He's like, good. I'm like, are you really good? And he's like, yeah. I'm like, are you sure you're not just saying you're good and you're dying inside? Because it is. And that is another thing we talk about all the time here. But for so long, I thought in my family, like, as long as Sarah doesn't have the alcohol in her system, she will be okay. And it's like, no, you take the alcohol away from me and I am not okay.
Yeah.
Like, alcohol makes me okay.
Yeah.
Alcohol makes me great.
Yeah.
And then you're going to take that away from me? Like, it's really, it's a hard, very uncomfortable thing. And getting thrown into recovery and doing, for me, some of these things were very uncomfortable for me to do. So it's just like, it was, that's why I do believe there's got to be this like surrendered moment, because why would you want to be uncomfortable? Why would you want to do all these things? Unless somebody just has a, dream to grow up to be an addict or an alcoholic one day, but most people don't.
No. Yeah. that was not on the plan.
Yeah.
For sure.
Right. Okay. So as far as we've talked a lot about like the brain and the addiction piece, but once somebody has recovered or they are in recovery and their brain, like, can their brain fully heal?
Yeah, so I think that's another sort of area in which we could certainly build out more research insofar as like the neuroscience of recovery. Right?
Yeah.
Like we know a lot about the neuroscience of like the acute stages of addiction or use disorder, but we know less about the acute, like what is occurring in the brain in recovery, right? And so a short answer is that yes, I believe that the brain does fully recover. I think that very little as far as like insults to the brain is permanent. Like there are very few things that are actually permanent in the brain. The brain's constantly changing based on your experience. You know, this whole idea of neuroplasticity, like it's happening all the time. It's happening with you. If you're learning anything right now, it's happening with me because I'm in this new environment and all this, right? It's just constantly our brains are changing and adapting. And that's like an essential part of our success as a species is the ability to do that and to form new memories based on whatever experience occurred, you know. It can take a while. Like I said, I mean, like it's the brain and biology in general prefers the path of least resistance. And when like a homeostatic balance has been achieved, it doesn't want to deviate from that. And that's why it can be hard to lose weight if somebody's trying to lose weight because the body has decided after years of stability, this is what it is. And I need to maintain certain amount of calories in order to keep everything the same.
Yeah.
And anytime you deviate from a homeostatic balance, it requires like persistent and consistent changes, and it's never comfortable.
Yeah.
You know, and so I think yes, the answer would be yes, and I think the problem is that it just takes time, and that I think what occurs with like in recovery with like 12 steps and is like you take these actions and it's sort of like brick and mortar behavioral driven neuroplasticity, right? Like meaning you're taking actions and like your brain begins to change, but it's very slow and it takes time. But yeah, outside of that, I mean, there have been certain papers and studies showing structural changes, especially with like amphetamine use and opiate use, you know, changes in white and gray matter, just, you know, some structural changes and things like that could certainly take even a little bit longer than receptor upregulation. But for the most part, I believe that you can fully recover. But that said, you know, I'm not willing to test it out as far as like, let's go see if we can use some drugs. But I think certainly like memories are sticky and anytime, you know, it's like memories involving trauma, like emotionally driven memories as well as reward driven memories are meant to be extremely durable. And so drug cues can often elicit a response, I mean, potentially for the rest of your life that you may see something in it. Oh, wow. It's not that it triggers you, but it may trigger you or may not, but it certainly will evoke some sort of a feeling inside like, ooh.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And it could be weird things like spoons or whatever the case, depending on what you were doing, you know?
Yeah.
So.
But I think that's important to point out is like somebody can't just eliminate spoons for the rest of their life. Right. So like obviously there has to be like freedom on the other side of it because we can't just live in a dark hole forever and be worried that we're going to be quote unquote triggered. But I know what you're saying. It's like, yes, like it can like bring back memories or have a certain, I don't know, thought or whatever. That's interesting for sure.
And I think, not to cut you off, I think that's also part of why these like sort of fellowship type recovery situations are so effective is that, you know, dopamine release is a really potent, so dopamine and serotonin and all these things are actually called neuromodulators. They alter the activity of excitatory or inhibitory neurons. And dopamine is meant to be a very potent propagator of neuroplasticity, right? And so I think part of the secret of success for some of these like 12-step groups or whatever the case is that there's a community aspect. And you start to form a community and you share openly and people engage with you and they respond to what you're saying and you feel validated and all these things are producing dopamine release. And I think, so it's like there really is some truth neuroscientifically to like embracing the community and getting involved and taking these actions because it's all stimulating the reward pathway, which
Right.
would effectively shorten the time it takes to produce some sorts of changes.
Yeah. And so I would like to know your opinion on. So we're talking about the science of it all, of course, but in many recovery programs or communities, there's this concept of a higher power. And so many would argue like it's just behavior modification then. Just change your behavior. What does it have to do with anything of like a higher power or something like that? You want to share on that?
Yeah. So, I think I've never been religious. That's not to say that I'm like an atheist.
Yeah.
In fact, I think being atheist, if one is to think that being like hyper religious is foolish or dogmatic, I think being atheist is equally dogmatic, right? Like you're like very sure that something doesn't exist, even though you don't have any proof that it doesn't, right?
Yeah.
So if I had to choose a camp, I would probably be agnostic in the sense of like, I can't disprove it, you know? I also have had experiences in my life that are statistically improbable and like highly ironic, you know? So it's in some respects, it's easier to believe that there's some kind of higher power. I think, I've had different sort of chapters of my recovery where I was hyper skeptical, hyper scientific, and was like, oh, like the higher power thing is basically just a really smart way of harnessing the placebo effect. A placebo effect of feeling the rewarding aspects of human connection 24 hours a day. But I don't necessarily subscribe to that belief anymore.
Yeah.
I think that like, my experience in getting sober I did the 12 steps was at least initially I didn't need to believe. I just needed to take action.
Yeah.
And like believe that this power greater than myself, which was the 12 steps, could get me sober, and it did.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think I'm open to it all.
Yeah.
I think that there's definitely something to, and again, even if, let's say there is no God, and let's say what I just said is true, we do know that there's a powerful effect of placebo. And if that is in fact what's happening, it's probably in your best interest to believe in some, and like, believe in some sort of power greater than you.
Yeah.
But, like I said, I'm agnostic, but I also I'd say I'm agnostic, but I'm like leaning in the direction of believing that there's a power greater than me. That's some sort of a higher power God thing that is not some dude up in the sky, but is more like a power that we'll never understand, but that is maintaining some sort of universal balance. I believe in that.
Yeah. Well, I'm just thinking of the story you shared the other day about having $21 in your wallet, and it was. We can get into that later, but that was the exact amount of money that you needed. And it's like these synchronicities in life are not coincidences.
Yeah.
So.
And as a scientist, I value empirical data, and I can look back at 13 years of recovery and so many situations like that as data. That it's like, it's just so improbable sometimes the things that happen that it almost makes more sense to say that there's something bigger going on here.
Yeah. Right.
So that's definitely where I stand. But I know like most of my sort of colleagues in the scientific world are usually atheists, and again, I think it's sort of hypocritical to be an atheist and think that somebody who's religious is like foolishly dogmatic, because they're both. Yeah. It both requires you to submit to some belief that you don't have any proof of.
Right. Yes. Okay. So, as far as like future plans in the science world of maybe like breakthroughs or things that could change treatment for the future. I know you've been studying on some things, and maybe not for necessarily just addiction, but like mental health and depression. I know you've been into the psychedelic stuff, which can be controversial, but also very, very interesting and fascinating.
Yeah.
So I'd love for you to share a little bit on that, what you do there.
Yeah. So to kind of backtrack a little bit, I had told you how I did the nonprofit, and then basically was like, at the end of that was like, if I could just get to the root of trauma, I could help, because all those people who were inmates at the jail who had sometimes done horrific crimes, were not bad people.
Yeah.
They were traumatized children that never had a chance. They never got the treatment that they needed. They never got the affection that they needed, whatever the case. And we just sort of, our solution is just put them in a cage, throw away the key, which is terrible.
Yeah.
So when I decided to get into neuroscience, it was like, well, I want to get at the root of trauma. I want to figure a way to provide treatment to people following some sort of an event and fix it before it becomes some really deeply entrenched belief system or disorder.
Yeah.
Enter psychedelics. So psychedelics, my interests, I've always sort of had an interest in psychedelics for a variety of reasons. My prior use with them, it was always a positive. Even during the dark times, I always had great experiences on psychedelics. They were like uplifting and enlightening, and I would feel a little glimmer of hope amidst the horror of a life that I was living. But it was actually when I was at the National Institute on Drug Abuse I happened to be right next door to the Johns Hopkins group. So this was in Baltimore. And there was also some publications coming out around how these drugs could produce had neuroplasticity effects. And so that's sort of when I really became interested in like pursuing this as like a scientific interest. To me, psychedelics are interesting because they have what I would call multi-diagnosis efficacy. So they seem to be effective for a variety of different disorders, right? We're pursuing psychedelic-assisted therapy for OCD, alcohol use disorder, opiate use disorder, major depression, anxiety-related disorders, PTSD, right? So it seems to be effective for a variety of these different like anxiety and affective type mood disorders. Mm-hmm. That's interesting to me because it suggests that it's acting on an underlying mechanism that's like at the root of all these disorders. And part of my gripe with psychiatry is the DSM-5 is stupid. I mean, it's the best we have, but essentially we like cluster people into a diagnosis based on behavior, when in fact there's like multiple different neurobiological roots that could present with the same behavior. And then we try to treat them with the same medication.
Yeah.
And it's just this guinea pig situation where we're not actually collecting data from the brain to make really logical decisions on how we're going to treat this person.
Yeah, I had a friend, she was just on here, and she was talking about she was on like almost 10 different medications to treat her alcoholism.
Yeah.
And so it's just, and she was like prescribed by a psychiatrist.
Yeah.
And I get they're doing, I could never be a psychiatrist, but yeah, it's tough.
It's crazy. And pharmacology is like a dirty game. It's like whack-a-mole. You like, this drug, like an SSRI or whatever the case, is meant to do a certain thing, but it's also doing all these other things, right? That's why anytime you see those commercials, when they're trying to quickly like rattle off that you might like start bleeding out of your eyes or whatever the case, it's like there's all these like off-target effects that we don't want. And so pharmacology is a pretty messy game, So psychedelics seem to be effective. Like I said, it seem to be effective for a variety of different disorders, but they also seem to be effective in kind of getting at the root. It seems like people have these experiences, and they have like a deep internal shift in the way in which they perceive traumatic memories. They're also able to access memories that may otherwise be sort of barricaded by subconscious defense mechanism walls. And so that to me was very interesting. Now, I don't know, to be honest, I don't know if psychedelics are the end stage here. Meaning I think that we'll learn a lot about these disorders from psychedelics. And so a lot of my research is focused on, so we know that psychedelics act on, especially like psilocybin and LSD, these sort of classical psychedelics is what they're called, that are structurally very similar to serotonin or act on a lot of serotonin receptors. We know that like the acute effects, like the visual hallucinations, are mediated through this serotonin 2A receptor. But we don't know how it is you can take 1 or 2 doses of a drug and have effects that last months to years, right? So there's been some studies. There was a study out of NYU where they were doing, it was anxiety related to like a terminal cancer diagnosis. And they had unbelievable results with the psilocybin-assisted therapy. They did a follow-up study 4.5 years later, and they were still seeing clinically relevant results. Like people were in remission from these like anxiety states.
Wow.
And so it's like that part we don't know. That's sort of the $1 million question. If you could figure out what these drugs are doing to promote durable changes in the brain like that, that would open the doors for the development of new drugs potentially, and or, inform something something called neuromodulation. So there's all kinds of, which I think may be more the direction we end up going. So there's things like transcranial magnetic stimulation, and something that's even newer, it's functional ultrasound, where they can basically use like an ultrasound and really pinpoint and localize the sound waves to a certain tiny brain region and change the function of what's going on in that brain region.
That's crazy.
So you can imagine from externally, you can modulate the activity of somebody's brain without having to drill any holes, without having any off-target effects from pharmacology. So there's a lot of studies looking at some of those treatments or strategies at fixing irregular circuit activity that is underlying depression or whatever the case. But I think psychedelics are definitely interesting. I think some of the potential bottlenecks, it's like with psilocybin assisted therapy. Let's say it clears FDA, and becomes a legal form of therapy. Currently, the paradigm is there's two therapists sitting with you. You're given this drug, psilocybin, in a capsule, and then for 3 to 6 hours, they probably can't let you drive home.
Yeah.
And so you can imagine it's going to make the cost of treatment extremely expensive, and so and impractical. And so there's a lot of push towards understanding how these drugs work to potentially develop drugs that provide the therapeutic effect but maybe don't have the visual hallucinations. I personally don't think it's possible, partially because my hypothesis is that what is something that could change your brain right now forever? An experience, right? If a plane came crashing through the ceiling here, you could have PTSD about these foam things on the wall or whatever, right?
Yeah.
You may have a memory or some sort of phobia, and it's like phobia is another example.
Yeah.
That all stems from some sort of a negative experience. And what psychedelics seem to do, when you put the blindfold on and you do the work, there's this whole work where you're doing you're setting an intention and you do the psycho. It's basically like psilocybin sandwiched by psychotherapy. So you do all this sort of work to prepare yourself on what you want to do, what you want to get out of it. You have the experience, and then there's this integration or whatever.
Right.
And so when you put the blindfold on, you're having an experience. Your eyes are closed, but there's an experience occurring. And so my guess is that that's what's actually producing the persistent changes.
Yeah.
I think that there's a place where we can use what we find out about psychedelics to create potentially a new antidepressant that you take every day that's more effective or something like that. That would not be hallucinogenic, hopefully. but so we'll see where it goes. I mean, I think
That's
for now,
wild.
it's an area, super interesting area, and there's a lot to learn. But I don't know that it'll be the end stage, and how it would fit into treatment centered situations. I mean, that's a whole nother
Seems
topic.
a little slippery slope for some of that stuff, but I think I did sit in a little group at a conference recently, and it's a woman. Gosh, now I can't remember her name. Amanda something, but she is on a show with Tyler Henry, the median or something. But she lost her husband during COVID, and it was she was on social media every day about it and everything, and how awful it was, and she was sharing in this group that she has done these treatments, and she does them, I don't know, maybe she said 9 months to a year or something, and how much it helped. And from something so painful and traumatic, for people to get help and freedom from that is really, really amazing. And so I am a big component of it. I just, earlier talking, I'm I don't even drink kombucha. I don't want to mess anything up, But everybody everyone has their own experience and their own individual, whatever. But it's just so fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah. And honestly, what we do know about drugs like psilocybin or LSD is that they don't really have an abuse liability. So it's the way in which you would determine that is will an animal press a lever to get more of it?
Yeah.
And they won't. So
interesting.
And from what I've heard, there are people that I know who are in recovery that have had these experiences, and it's not like a drug experience. Like they don't emerge from that being like, oh, I want to do that again. It's more like, man, that was intense. I'm good on that, but it was a humongous, like an incredibly impactful experience.
Yeah.
And oftentimes, most of what's interesting about it is it's like a lot of it's subconscious, right? Like it's almost like getting connected with an emotion that you suppressed when you were 5 years old, and they cry and they release it, and then like they're a different person.
Yes.
And so like it seems like there's what these drugs are providing is relief that would never otherwise be unattainable, or maybe it would take 10 years of psychotherapy to get there. And so I think that there is a place for it for use disorders. I think that we're obviously not killing it as far as like success rates, and because again, like I mentioned, at least in my experience, it's a brick and mortar. You have to show up. You have to take these actions that are uncomfortable, that go against everything you've ever done in your life, and you don't want to do it, and you're not really seeing any results, but you just have to keep doing it.
Right.
Versus like these drugs seem to produce an effect right away, and they also increase sort of the building blocks or the chemicals needed for neuroplasticity. So it sort of makes your brain more moldable.
Crazy.
Yeah.
Well, is there anything else you want to add on this topic before we close out our part 1?
No, I think we did a pretty good job of covering everything.
Yeah.
In terms of science go.
Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't know, but I think we did.
Yeah.
I learned a lot in this little hour, so thank you.
A lot of neuroplasticity going on.
Yeah. A lot of words I can't say, but that's all right. I get the gist. Okay. Well, thank you. And thank you all for tuning in for another episode of Impacting Recovery Uncensored. I hope today's conversation has inspired you, opened your mind, maybe even your heart a little bit. But remember, you're not alone. If you found this episode helpful, please like and subscribe and share with someone who needs to hear it. We will have all the links to our social below. And until next time, keep making an impact. Bye, y'all.